Hi, everyone. I'm Karen Webster, and welcome to our conversation today about how fraudsters fake IDs in an effort to commit fraud. With me today to have that conversation is Kevin Trilli, Interim CTO and Chief Product Officer at Onfido. Kevin, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Karen, for having me.
So there's nothing like talking about fraudsters to draw a crowd, and today we're going to talk about the 5 ways that fraudsters fake IDs and how they do it in any number of ways by creating fake identities and spoofing the faces on documents that are otherwise authentic. We've got some interesting insights to share, but before we dig in, I wanted to share a sort of unbelievable story about fake identities that I discovered when doing some background prep for this meeting. So Kevin, I'm going to give you a pop quiz. Does the name Frederick Bourdon ring a bell?
You know, I hope it doesn't in my case, but yes, it does ring a bell.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm going to tell you the story anyway, because it probably doesn't ring a bell for everybody listening. So this guy's alias is the Chameleon, and I'm sure you probably have figured out why. He managed to physically now assume the identity of more than 500 people, even those who weren't French, despite having a French accent. One of his most prolific fakes, unfortunately, was to assume the identities of missing children, which he allegedly did 3 times. One of those times was of a 13-year-old Texas boy who went missing in 1994. 3 years later, when sadly that kid hadn't been found alive or dead, Bourdon, who was living in France, assumed his identity and was flown to the U.S. to be reunited with his fake family, who welcomed him with open arms even though he had brown eyes, the missing kid's eyes were blue, a French accent, and different shaped ears. He managed to convince his fake mom and dad that he was captured by a child prostitution ring that had altered his eye color, and I don't know, I guess taught him French, swapped out his ears, but anyway, he lived there fine for 1 year. Neighbors were suspicious, though, and alerted authorities, who began to investigate and finally discovered the ruse after taking his fingerprints. He was sent to jail for 6 years, but reemerged and kept doing these little hoaxes undaunted. So I guess they've made a documentary about this guy. I mean, it's a true story, sad but true, but I think illustrates 2 important points that we'll come back to in our discussion today. One is the boldness and confidence of fraudsters. I mean, it took real guts to do what this guy did. He wasn't just passing off a fake ID. He was living with a family who should have known their own son, but he was convincing enough, and his story was convincing enough to pass muster. It wasn't even his so-called parents who ratted him out. It was other people, and it took a year to do that. And I guess that's the second point, which is the vulnerabilities of people, of humans. The missing child's parents obviously wanted to believe that he was the real deal, but it took technology, getting his fingerprints, to discover the truth. So Kevin, I guess what I'm taking from this is that we know tech has evolved a long way since 1994, but unfortunately so has the fraudsters' boldness, confidence, and incentives to keep tricking us. And if you don't believe that, with 1 in every 60 online transactions now attributable to fraud, we better be on our toes. What do you think of that story?
Amazing, and thankfully I'm not part of those unlucky 500 people you mentioned, but it just shows the sophistication and the motivation of the fraudsters in the world today. And it's pretty scary because you just don't know what you don't know in these cases, and for those unfortunate people, it's really a tough situation.
Yeah, for sure. Well, with that, I'm going to let you set us up. So, how are they doing this? I mean, if this guy could do it physically online, I don't know, is it easier or harder?
Yeah, that's the great segue into what we'll talk about today. So the digital environment opens up new channels for some of the sophistication levels to become even easier to access. You know, sophistication level, is even more sophisticated in some cases because they're using a network model where they can access data, where they can access services from anywhere in the world. So there's no need to get on a plane to hack a website, you know, and to get into our bank account or whatever it may be. So the digital side of that story brings in new challenges, and that's really the focus that we'll cover today of some of the uniqueness of the digital environment, but it layers on top of the story you just told, which was horrifying, of still that motivation. The business model for these people are still out there. And now with the network effect of online services, they're spraying and praying even more so and going after a lot of different services and reaching people halfway around the world.
For sure. So let's get into the details. Sure. Identity fraud.
Identity fraud, let's talk about it. So, you know, a few things we wanted to cover today. I think, you know, you set up perfectly with your example, and we'll take a digital view of this story a bit. And, you know, I think this is one of those slides that just self-updates itself every time you put it up there with the recent story. So without going through this with your readers and your listeners, you know, I think you can see, and everyone's aware of these things, that the question really becomes that, you know, the fraud side continues to grow, and, you know, maybe there's a small dip there for a while after a peak. There's still a big problem in terms of fraud losses. There's lots more victims that are, you know, being attacked. And, you know, the types of services you can tell that are going on are all pretty modern names. You know, you think about Target as maybe kind of the old school approach, but the Uber, you know, situation, we, you know, here in the U.S., you know, with the credit bureaus, we have all sorts of different centralized databases of identity data that are being compromised and used in these scenarios that you described with Mr. Baudon. So we have a concern there of, like, what do we do about this problem? Because I think some of the old methods and even some of the more recent technological methods are, you know, hitting the end of their usefulness and their life cycle, and new approaches are needed here. So this is a little provocative of a front person here. So, you know,
he's scary.
Two options.
I mean, he would do it for me. He would do it for me.
That's an important point here, right? So we've all had to walk into a bar or a pub, and, you know, hopefully, and still for myself, it's a compliment that I get asked for my ID once in a while. But, you know, a front-end approach to this is, of course, proving your identity before you get access. And then our nice looking gentleman here is hopefully a deterrent to anybody that's going to try and cheat that system. So on the digital analog of that, you hope that you have some system in place that not only is verifying a user, you know, the first time they create an account or when they're coming back to their account, but also is serving as a deterrent so that it's harder for these folks to get in and really attack the front door, as I like to call it. You know, the flip side is you let people in.
Right, but it can't be too scary, right? Because then people don't go in. Like I would not want to go past that guy.
There is a balance, and you're bringing in a point we'll cover later, which is user experience, which is a fantastic point. And anyone that's been in security for any point in time knows there's an X curve of higher security means sometimes, you know, worse user experience, and you need to find that optimization. So yes, I think this shows sort of the high security approach that might detract from people from coming through the front door, or in the case of a website, creating an account. Absolutely great point, Karen. The flip side of that is you let a lot of people in. So you ask this gentleman to take the night off and let people in the front door, and you have people inside the club that are watching for bad behavior, or people that are potentially picking wallets, or whatever the analogy might be. So it's more of the behavioral analysis of the users once they're on the service or the site or your whatever the application may be. So you have two options, and this is the trade-off, because it's usually not just one, it's some combination of both. And this really gets into the conversation of business risk. So as we think about it, just a nice graphic that hopefully is very common to a lot of people, that this exact point about user experience comes into play when you start to think about an authentication system and making a decision, which is your business risk decision. You might be perfectly happy with accepting a little bit of fraud in your system. Whatever that may be, that's your business model decision. The other trade-off is that, like we said with our scary guy there, that you may want to have the user experience very, very soft and very open so you get a lot of users. And this is that passive versus active point you see there in the two red boxes, where there's different ways to probe people that either directly require their input, or they can just sort of happen in the background behind the scenes. And, you know, I think the ultimate play here is how do you figure out how to combine those approaches, and maybe you can cascade them and have some passive, you know, background things happening, and that might trigger a high risk flag, of which then you need to come back to them and go, okay, time for me to see your ID, or time for me to do something that involves your direct confirmation of something. And ultimately that gets your access control decision and into the application. And as I mentioned, that just begins now the monitoring on the bottom left corner there, the diagram, which says it's not over, because they might have broke through the system, or they're so sophisticated that they were able to break through. You still need to watch them and see what's going on, either in aggregate or individual users.
So Kevin, let me ask you a question going back to our scary guy in front of the club. So
should I put him back up?
No, well, there's also, I mean, he's kind of scary to look at. But there's the consumer expectation too, right? So if I think about the club, you know, I know that I, as a person going into that environment, have to be vigilant to protect my wallet and person and things like that.
Yep.
So I know that I share responsibility as a consumer, but I also expect, you know, the club or the restaurant to have adequate protections in place. And that balance probably changes based on where I am, maybe what time I'm in a place like that. And I'm just wondering how that kind of trade-off from the consumer and environment perspective plays into the risk experience.
Yeah, that's a great point, because I think, you know, you have to bring the compliance word in a little bit, where sometimes businesses need a little shove to bring these services and make them available for their consumers. So sometimes they're required, and a base level, you know, a law, usually it's state, you know, federal, different countries, whatever, will require something along those lines. But at the same point, the consumer needs to realize that there's some part of this that's good for me and you, right? Like the fact that I need to go jump through a few hoops occasionally to get into my investment account, I should take a step back and go, I'm kind of happy they're doing that, because if they didn't, you know, it's just that much easier for someone to get in on my behalf. So I think the consumer needs to be a little realistic that says friction is part of our life at this point. And we see it in different ways in our offline world. And we have to accept some part of that for the online world. And the flip, you know, the point is that if it's not there, then you start to wonder, can you even trust the system itself? Yeah. Now, as we've talked about a couple of times, there's a fine line of how far that can go and when do you do it. So you've got to take a customer experience perspective when you're implementing these kind of systems.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I should have mentioned at the start, feel free, those of you who are listening in, feel free to pop your questions our way. We'll insert them into the conversation. I don't want you guys to lose track of any thoughts that you have as we're going through this, and our minds are thinking about that bouncer. All right, so how do we apply all of this to the real world online?
Yep. So we're going to talk today about the identity verification portion of this. So the behavioral back-end risk modeling we'll leave for a separate day. But then the question really comes down to, like, what's the best way to do this? And as we all know, you know, all of us use, you know, your audience especially uses online payments and uses their mobile phone to you know, sometimes contactless pay. It's very convenient. It's very safe, secure. You know, everything's got some degree of vulnerability, but for the most part, it's a good system. There is no digital identity nirvana today that we can use, where we can just flip our phone out and go, bing, here it is for this context, here it is for that context. This is my persona I want to share here, different persona for this case. It's just not there today. So the question is, how do we think about what we can use today at scale to make this work? And a little matrix here that just starts to show on the left-hand side some of the considerations of different models that we have to consider in terms of the usage, the customer experience, like how reliable is the mechanism, how globally or regionally ubiquitous is it so that it can cover all constituents, obviously TCO and what it's cost to implement, and then this user experience point. So as you look at these different models, there's all sorts of like arrows that modify kind of trends on these boxes, but just to simplify the discussion, you know, the social identity, to pick one example, is very ubiquitous for lots of people. But to be able to use that social identity to create an investment account at a financial institution is just not there today, right? It's a different context of an identity, and it's just not there. So you can't use that in some of these places where fraudsters are going to go. They clearly want to attack my social identity and use it, but they also want to attack where the money's at and go to the bank. So each one of these mechanisms has pros and cons that as you start to think about how do you pick one, you know, you've got to look at all these parameters and make some decisions on what's an optimal balance across each one of these. And so the docs represents your government document that's sitting in your wallet, and you know, everyone has some version of that, whether it's a driver's license, passport, or other. And biometrics is the other part. We all walk around with our face and our fingers, and you know, the combination of those two is what we feel is the best optimal balance right now to do this at scale.
The question, though, on, you know, which I think is interesting is, yes, high reliability, high ubiquity, but doesn't that also make them, vulnerable, absent the right, the right risk controls, because they are so pervasive?
A great point. And that's why I think the key point out of your question is that you just can't, there's different answers for both of these, but you just can't trust them as is. And that's really the crux of some of our conversation, is that you need to still ensure that they are reliable. You can't just take them at face value, but once you can prove that, they are reliable. And you're absolutely right. There's a step that's included in that. Now, the flip side would be if we go to the database model, and I don't want to pick on any one mechanism, but I've am a personal victim of that. It's tough to go back and reuse data that's already been compromised. It's it's just done. It's out there. Where if you find a fraudulent doc, for example, you can reject it, and it's just an individual case. It's not a systematic or aggregate case. So I think that's what I'm trying to highlight here on the slide.
Yeah,
and your questions.
I think that's a good point. I mean, it is an instance of an identity, opportunity or identity moment. It's not your entire identity that's been compromised.
I think to build on your question, the biometric part, we don't want that compromised, right? Because they're the same thing. There's no going back on that.
but that is what makes people nervous about it, though. I mean, I take your point that there's reliability. It depends, I guess, too. I mean, weather conditions can compromise biometrics if you're talking about fingerprint. And there are examples of, if you part your hair differently, it might not recognize you. I don't know what that's. But that's what some people have written about. But it's, all of these things sound, terrific, but have, they have to come with the wrapper that gives consumers the confidence that it's safe and secure.
Absolutely. And, in each one of these cases, and the underlying system for all of them, and this is the big broader conversation about digital identity, clearly, much like the payment system that built and evolved over many decades, privacy and security are just so core to this conversation where, yes, the user needs to ultimately be in control. We've kind of proven that industry as a holder of that data cannot be trusted, for better or for worse. There is this vision in the future, right? But we're not there today. There's a big fundamental infrastructure that needs to be laid to get there, and it's moving. It's just a slow-moving train.
Okay, so take us through it.
Okay, so real quick, we'll just kind of deep dive into this document and face verification, just to give you a little bit of an explanation of what it means, because your question was so good in terms of great, let's say we believe in that. How do we trust it? How do we use it? So there's really three steps that go into this process from a high level. And one is, again, being able, as you mentioned, to verify that a given document is trustworthy. And that's a tough problem, because how many different documents are out there? We'll talk about this a little bit later. There's thousands. How many different countries all issue their own, right? That kind of thing. You get into the next part, which is a document by itself is just not going to take you there, because what if my document's stolen, right? And so you've got to bind that to a real person. And in a digital environment, there's not a lot of ways to do that outside of matching it to some digital image of myself through a biometric capture. And that could be a video of myself, a fingerprint, a voice. But there, as we all know, there's no magical database of that information being registered and stored, to our knowledge at least, and hopefully it isn't. So you can't just go look that up. And that's why these two need to be combined, that you need to compare that the identity in the document that the user is purporting to be actually matches that person in real time through this digital interface that we all are playing on right now, right? So that's the core step there, a proof of ownership of that document. And then finally, you can modify that or extend that with certain attributes about a person, because an identity might be, the most important layer, but other layers exist on top of that, whether or not they are desirable people to have into your application. So there's all sorts of different modification or modifiers of that, politically involved folks or sanction lists or all the bad person lists. So there's ways that you can also filter once you know what that identity is to look at that. So that's the high level process.
But this process assumes that the document is legit.
Correct. And let's talk exactly about how do you do that.
Yep.
So a document in a digital environment, again, is some manifestation of its physical image. And so you need to look at the 5 factors that we just have listed there, which help you confirm in that digital moment when we're looking at it, the instant, that it is trustworthy. And so the first thing you need to look at was the original document modified in its physical instance before it was captured digitally? Was it modified digitally once it was captured? So that's sort of post-processing on the end user side. And then you need to remove the data from the document and start to look at lots of the security features that are contained within that document. This is where all the different documents have different types of rules. You know, there's MRZs, different encodings, different ways that fonts are used and layouts, all sorts of different characteristics that help. Again, maybe they're not 100% protected, but they create these deterrents, watermarks, et cetera, that help prevent just an easy, you know, fraudster from getting in there and trying to take it away. And then, of course, was the document actually a valid document, and was it issued from a legitimate source? So these are the things that ultimately need to be in place to go to that first level, which is, can I trust that the document is useful for the sake of this identity I'm claiming to be?
You know, it's funny, you know, going through the airport when you present your boarding pass and your driver's license or passport. I mean, sometimes the resemblance of the picture on the license doesn't really look like the person. I mean, let's face it, but they're still looking at that and making that comparison. So you kind of wonder sometimes, you know, there has to be another way to, you know, make this whole process a little bit more secure.
Yeah, I mean, there's always things that you need to consider more, and there's different characteristics of a human that, you know, and I recently put a white paper on this, and I just remember the one comment was like, there are certain aspects of your existence as a person that just don't change. There are other aspects as you get older and things that slightly change, right? And so those are the things that, as you're looking at this type of process, you've got to find those things that don't change, and then have some rules around things like eye color that might change slightly over time, or wrinkles, or whatever that may be, like you mentioned with hair. But those things need to be filtered out so that you're getting to the core identity of the person. Absolutely.
Got it. Okay.
So with that, let's just kind of talk about the next step, obviously, as we mentioned, is that the image of the individual needs to be captured digitally. And the mobile phone is the game-changing technology that has enabled this whole space to occur, right? We all have phones that have at least, you know, a fairly high resolution capture image, and allows that image to be of certain fidelity, so a lot of forensics can be run on it behind the scenes. Yep. So that's really the core enablement that allows you to capture the identity document, and then, of course, to capture an image of yourself, and to know that it's been captured live at that point. It's not some static image that's been modified. And then the next part is, how do you compare those two, right? The images, as you mentioned, the image that may be a little dated to the current image of yourself in the context of whatever you are, you know, and how you look that day particularly, and make sure they can be considered similar.
Got it. But there's always the question of, you know, the liveness detection and making sure that the person is really the person and not a picture of that person.
Right. And that gets tricky. So there's additional layers you put on top of this, which would be impersonation, right? So as we'll talk about in the next section, there's just some unbelievable technology that's available now at scale that is making it very easy to create digital representations of people that's horrifyingly realistic. And so you need to put this technique in. And again, this is the whole point where this requires more of the user to do something. So this is, you know, a sort of a layer step on top that, you know, allows you to bring in more certainty to the user, and that they are actually not being impersonated. And so you can do that through challenge response, or through motion of the human to make sure it simulates a human, that kind of thing. Interesting.
I mean, the look over your left shoulder is actually kind of cool. I hadn't seen that before. I've seen the, you know, challenge code kind of thing, but that's interesting. So now that we know what we're supposed to do, how are fraudsters gaming the system?
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about this, and I think it kind of builds up to some of the points that we've started to highlight. So there's a number of different mechanisms for just the document side, and I think most of these are fairly intuitive to people. But, you know, there's all sorts of examples I'll show here for the next couple slides around these different types of things that a system needs to find these and determine whether or not this is happening or not. Now, I think that the important context here is, like, let's pick a number. 99% of people plus are good and legitimate, right? It's just this small minority, pick your number, 1%, 0.5%, that you're trying to find. So this user experience concept becomes very important when you start to think about these different examples here about how do you determine these without affecting all the goods, right? So counterfeit documents are, really when, these templates are available where people can go out and make documents with their own information, right? And so these are available on the dark web and the black market, and they're able to create, realistic looking identities with fake information based on a template. Forged documents are when they're taking existing documents and changing, as we talked about earlier, whether they're making physical modifications or layers on top of existing documents and adding, different pictures and different things to existing documents. You can find these, unfortunately, where people are able to obtain, stolen documents and be able to start from scratch and really work with legitimate things. This is a couple of cases of delivery trucks being ripped off and huge troughs of this type of thing happening where people have a whole factory now to start to work off of raw material for fake IDs.
Wow, that's amazing.
And, this is the case where, people go out and, like I think maybe you described earlier with Mr. Rodon, where you can get someone else's information and then go apply for an identity document in their name. And that's a tough one. That's a real tough one to find, right, and detect, because it's a legitimate ID with the information that was captured up front.
Yep.
And then we get this kind of goes to the skill set of the reviewer or the verifier, which sometimes you get some of these real examples of people presenting documents that aren't even real, and they're able to fool some people. And this comes down to the training that's required. It is pretty funny.
I mean, it's funny, sad, but hopefully not a lot of that.
Exactly.
I love the passport, the global citizen passport. It was so funny.
That is it is great. And then, imposters, this is just another example of that. So you see these different things. So I think what we get into next are really, once we understand all these different document vectors, there's really the person side of this. So again, we're keeping in mind this is a digital environment. And in a digital environment, you can submit an image of yourself in different ways. So the top row basically shows how you can do that with static representations, where you take a picture of it, take a picture of someone's Facebook or LinkedIn page, or a printed photo and scan that. All that starts to indicate, not to say that it's completely a fraudster, but they're not live. And sort of it becomes a weaker signal in the risk engine concept that we talked about. The bottom part's kind of what we're getting into, which is like what's happening now in the sophistication that if we look a couple years out, starting now, these are the things we got to start to consider when you start to talk about some of those sophisticated fraudsters that have a lot of motivation. And the next slide really is a great case of exemplifying that. So this came up, and if we can all keep our partisan thought aside here, this is an example not to talk about politics, but to illustrate an example that came out, I believe it was April of this year, to talk about fake news and different things that were going on in the political arenas. And Jordan Peele is an actor in America and a director, and was able to create a video of himself talking through Obama's existing video, where he put in his own words, and his mouth basically showed the lip movement inside of Obama speaking and saying different things that you would not, obviously he would not have said himself. I didn't want to play the video because there's just a warning to some people, there's some things that might not be politically correct. But the key point is, if you see this video, it's pretty shocking to see what basic technology available today can do. And so then you start to put back into our context of not fake news, but someone trying to pose as Kevin Trilli online might have found this, a live podcast of myself where there's a video, and be able to superimpose that with something that looks and sounds a lot like myself. So if you see those couple snippets over from the article where you've got some researchers from the University of Munich talking about this, this is really hard to figure out if you're a human. And the good news is that, even at that, the research level, that they're starting to figure out how to determine this a little bit more at scale and more accurately with technology, and a lot of what we'll talk about in the second part of this conversation. But a perfect example of tools that are available today through Reddit and, you know, other those common distribution channels. And they're going to be just improving rapidly. And major companies are putting some of these tools out also for good reasons, just to make videos and, you know, help with production of different types of things. But these are tools that will be available and extended for the wrong reasons, obviously, when you start to think about people trying to create a proof of themselves being legit online.
Wow, that is that's very sobering. I mean, you know, we can kind of all smile at the global citizen passport, but you know, this is quite sophisticated, because most people, you know, it's not like manufacturing quotes and putting it next to a person's picture, you know, in the Facebook news feed or, you know, those kinds of things. I mean, this is actually taking over the persona of you know, of someone and representing it as the real thing, which would be almost, you know, undetectable.
It's
wow.
tough. And so there's an arms race, right? And again, as you think about the documents that are out there and just relying solely on them, you need some form of biometric binding, right? And again, going back to our friendly bouncer there, a little deterrent's not a bad thing, because if you're being forced to capture an image of yourself, that might be enough to have someone walk away, unless they're as bold as Mr. Bordone, because once that biometric's captured, you know, it's there, right? And then that could be used in the future to find that person, come back on, because lots of these fraudsters come back several times. So you also think about, now you see the binding of importance of these two and how both of these need to be innovated from a detection perspective simultaneously.
I mean, so basically, it's not. It isn't just one thing anymore. It has to be multiple layers, and biometrics are, you know, one of the important layers to authenticate individuals.
It's hard to accept that's our reality, but it's true. And if you think about our offline world, like you said, at the airport, and, you know, I go a lot through Heathrow, and, you know, the automated process they have there, you know, like a lot of that is, you know, obviously taking an image of myself and looking at my passport and doing some comparison. This is the state of the art that's being used, you know, in the real world, and is also needed for this digital world, because it's just that much easier to spoof, as we can see here.
But how do you get this? For this to be effective, this has to work at scale, and there has to be a consistent way of deploying this. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So the challenge we have here, as we sort of led up a little bit, is that you're looking, at least in this current world, you're looking at a trade-off, right? And the trade-off is that you want to make a system. I mean, the digital world, in many cases, is regional in some parts, but in many cases it's global, right? A lot of the systems we use have global brands, and, you know, in some cases, you know, maybe some of our financial institutions are more regional, but you still need to think about that there are lots of different types of identity documents that need to be accessed if you're going to service this approach. The biometric side becomes even more complicated, in that you've got billions of people, we're all unique, lots of different cultures, you know, lots of people, you know, going through the wonderful aging process and changing slightly. And you've got to be able to figure out how to solve both of those very complex problem sets. And our friends over there on the fraud side are not sitting still. They are analyzing every system. They are trying things, seeing what works, poking around, you know, trying 10 different approaches. If one works, they stick with it and then just hammer it. So we've got to think about, they're not sitting still, and they're sort of coming into a system all the time trying to test it. And then, as you see on the bottom of the page, me and you as consumers really don't care about that. We just want to get into our service fast and use it, right? And we want to have some feeling of trust, some feeling of privacy, and some feeling that our data is secure, right? And it all comes down to that, as we've proven over and over with our user behavior as an aggregate, that convenience and speed really, really matter. So this is the challenge, right? And it's a human challenge, right? We're trying to take our offline ID, use it to prove who we are online, and then build trust in that system.
But it also, I mean, the question, I was waiting to ask the question until we got to this point. I mean, you know, one of the challenges is the sophistication of the fraudsters and the tools that they're using to create these synthetic identities and attaching their own biometric, you know, fingerprints, facial, whatever, to that synthetic identity. How do you unravel that?
Yeah, and I think there's a lot in there where, again, you can't just use one approach. You have to really look at this biometric part. You have to keep track of known fraudulent pieces so that you can look, because again, they're going to come back over and over. In some cases, you might not get them the first time. Like anybody that says any system out there is going to work 100% of the time isn't being realistic, right? And that's why we say this is definitely a risk conversation, right? So at some point, it's almost, dude, don't fool me more than once kind of scenario here where they may get by once, but you need to be able to catch them the second and end times and know that they're going to be doing a network effect across other types of similar services or other types of business models that have a prize at the end. So as much as you need to innovate these two different areas, you also need to make sure that you're keeping track. And I've said it in past on other conversations like this, it's an industry problem to some degree. It can't be solved in isolation. Just like we've seen in payment fraud, there needs to be some pooling together, some sharing, and really, applying everyone's best intelligence and experience to find these people that when they come back a second and third time. It's a tough problem.
I mean, it is a tough problem. So how are you thinking about this problem?
Yeah, and I think just in terms of approach, I think we've all remembered the days of going through the airport 100%, and it was a very manual problem. Well, maybe I remember it, but maybe many people don't. I think technology, you're starting to see technology more and more even in the offline world, right? And then the question becomes, in the digital world, you don't have the ability for a person to sit there and obviously look at every single registration or every single transaction. Yeah. You can do some of that with a back office scenario, but over time, again, you start to think about this requirement of convenience and speed, that you just need to think of a technological approach that's going to address this problem. And so I'll share a little bit of the color on how we've thought about the problem in Onfido, just in terms of the approach, so you can start to understand how we take these three pieces here and marry it up to that blue layer at the bottom. And the fundamental aspect of this, and we've all heard about how artificial intelligence can be used in different ways. This is a perfect problem where you have this massively complex matrix that needs to happen extremely quickly, that needs to happen at global scale, that needs to consider the 99% good and the less than 1% bad, and has to be accurate, right? And so the point of that is you can't just build that system in a classic waterfall method and launch it, right? Because it's got to be a constant learning system. So when we think about it, it's what we call a hybrid or a supervised machine learning approach, and it uses both the best of humans and machine learning in a way that allows those things to be hit, right? And so a perfect example in the next chart that I'll show, this is a little curve that I'll explain in a moment, which is the accuracy of the system is on the Y and then time is on the X. And what this basically means that for any new system, the shaded area is when a machine learning system has not seen a particular threat attack before. So the only way for you to detect it is through some set of human experts. But we also know that the limitation of the human is I get tired, I get, bad training, or, whatever it may be. There's inaccuracies that are going to happen where it's a limited asymptote of human performance as you see that curve. But they have a very important role where they're able to teach the system and supervise it and then allow the system, which is that next shaded curve, to take off. And as you can see, sort of halfway through the page there's a crossover point where now the machine's been trained to perform better than the human. And then over time, the performance uplift happens at scale. And that's really the only solution that we see on this particular approach, where you can't just keep throwing people at the problem, right? It's just never going to solve the type of parameters that are necessary that we just described.
How do you respond to critics who say, yeah, but suppose the people teaching the system, are teaching it perhaps not as accurately as they need to? Who's the check on the human to make sure that the machine is learning the right stuff?
Yeah, no, and I think that's a great question, because there's different levels of expertise in a particular system. And as we kind of show a workflow here of a risk engine, you have sort of on the left the inputs to the system. You've got your sort of processing in the middle. And the bottom part there is really the offline process where the machine learning model is being taught. But if you look on the right there, you need to have an input, which is the true expertise that goes into the system, which is like the policy, right? So you need the best in the business over there. So in order for a system like this to work, you need to literally have people that are from, a long tenure of document fraud analysis, that know like the practical examples of fraud, that know the applications. Maybe they come from, immigration controls in different countries like we have in our company. But those are the people that are like the best in the business. Their job is to stay current on what's in the state of affairs, right? They're out at all the conferences. They're interacting with all the different, leading players at the different companies that are in this problem space. And they're bringing in that intelligence, right? That goes into the bottom, which is the how do you detect it? So this is where you have your machine learning scientists that are taking that input and then using the practical data that's coming from the human dark blue process and trying to replace that human detection with machine detection. So it takes those three components to make it work and address the point that you're bringing up.
Mm-hmm. And so is the first step to make sure the document being presented is authentic, and then you're double proving that with the biometrics? Is that what this process is about? Because you have to certify that the document itself is authentic.
Exactly. So it's a good thing to illustrate, which is really the output of some sort of system like that. So this is one example of what you're pointing out, which is like, how do you know that this image is trustworthy? And if you can think about what's going on in the back end is that there's an analysis going on. In the old world, it was a human eye, and in this new world, it's a digital algorithm that's looking at it. And what you're starting to see in these two examples are two outputs of an algorithmic approach to determining whether or not a document has some indication of fraud tampering. Anywhere you see red are indicators that there's something that's an anomaly or that can be indicating some sort of fraudulent tampering. And the other colors are more just sort of, okay, in terms of the more green they get, the more normal they are. So this is what you need to start to look at digital representations of documents, and to be able to do that analysis of the JPEG or the analysis of all the different fonts or the analysis of the parameters of that document that start to show whether or not a fraudster has attacked it or not.
Mm-hmm. So this is a problem. Someone sees this is a problem, correct?
Yes. Absolutely.
Interesting.
Now,
I wanted to see more. I wanted to see more red. Actually, I wanted to see more red, but
So
I guess
and the thing is, I'm sorry. So the red can be very subtle, right? You don't want to change too much because they think it's good. It takes more work and it's harder to do. So the one on the left shows where they just did some very small little fine changes to the document ID number there. And the one on the right is a completely different image where a lot more was replaced. What we see right now is a lot of image swapping going out. So a lot of people are taking off their picture and putting it in, so that on the right-hand side, you would have seen that be much more red if that was the case. So that's the indications of what, these can be subtle little changes, or they can be really poorly done, obvious changes that we can pick up very easily. So the less red you see, unfortunately, is more sophisticated.
I was going to say that's it. This is someone that obviously knows what they're doing, and without good technology, would probably be able to do bad stuff.
Yep, they oftentimes will try multiple approaches, right? So they'll submit 10 different types of IDs and try to change, one thing in each ID and see which one gets through. And that's kind of what you see in this case on the left.
Got it. Wow.
And, just correspondingly to that, how do you know when somebody is really playing with their image? And so what you see on the right are three varying heat maps that we use with our algorithms to determine whether or not there has been some analysis. So it's looking for patterns, and the yellow indicates more of a probability of a spoof, that there's been some changes in the image that's not expected. And these are very hard to find if you're just, in some cases, like the person side, this one's illustrative, but these can be pretty sophisticated as we start to look at some of these masks and things that we were talking about earlier with the Obama video, where this becomes a much harder problem. But this, again, is an output of what that algorithm can help determine to give that, risk trigger to someone to go say, take a look at this one. We think there's a big problem here.
Wow. Where, Kevin, are you seeing the biggest interest in this kind of technology use cases? Is it account opening? What is the use case that's driving a lot of the interest and the demand?
Yeah, I think like any technology that's sort of in its emerging to scaling phase, which is what this industry is in currently today, there's the case of when you can use it and the user experience sort of optimization, right? A lot of where we see this used initially is going to be in the account onboarding step. And again, the drive here is to make this work as fast as possible and as accurate as possible. So there's different ways you can put it into the process. It can be literally right in the initial account creation stage. It could be once you've created the account, you're sort of in provisional state, and there's a second step you need to do once the personal information has been captured, because the marketing team would like to get that unabated. There's different slots where you can put it into that process. Other use cases we're seeing also now is just helping with sort of it's starting more so to now show its head into very traditional e-commerce fraud detection. So when transactions and chargebacks are being looked at with an aggregate model, you can start to look at how the implementation of this as a cascade or a trigger all of a sudden shows up in the account. Hey, we've been noticing some strange behavior. Now it's time for you to come out and do that layered authentication or that risk-based authentication because something has indicated a problem. So we're starting to see more and more of that. And then I think there's just lots of digital use cases that don't have home offices. So the digitization of banking, that driving services where there is no home office, where you can go in and show that you're a legitimate driver. All the shared economy types of services where people are offering their own houses and dog walking and all those different places where you're trusting people you don't know to do things for you, that you'd feel pretty good about that, or much better about that if you knew who the person was legitimately.
Yep. I think about some of the processes though that are still so antiquated. I was doing something a couple of weeks ago, and I was asked to make a photocopy of my driver's license. I'm like, really? Okay.
Exactly.
That seems really like a secure thing. But that seems so prevalent.
Yeah, and I think part of it is that even though as we talk about this as an online set of technologies, that anything that this is all technology that can be embedded in any sort of device. And again, the office of today is using technology that's all cloud-based and all that. So you'll see more and more of this type of stuff get used in offices more so to replace those really useless processes.
Right. But it does suggest that, there has to be some catalyst for prompting the wide scale, embrace of this. What is that? What is that catalyst, Kevin, in your view? Does it require standard industry momentum? What is it?
I think there's a couple things here. So the government likes to offer incentives in the form of regulations and compliance, and this started way back in the days of money laundering laws and knowing your customer. So the financial institutions really don't have much of a choice in this, but I think where the financial institutions are being encouraged by these types of things is, like you just described, going to a branch office to open an account and sitting around and waiting for 15 minutes in the lobby, having your driver's license photocopied and thrown in a pile. That whole experience is becoming important because you have challenger banks and different types of fully digital business models that are disrupting some of these older business models. So I think that's giving sort of the business side incentive. The consumer side is a little harder. As you know, we all want convenience, but we don't want convenience on top of something that's not secure. But that's a harder barge to turn because of consumer behavior, and myself included, being naturally sort of lazy and defaulting to convenience over security. And we've seen it time and time again with some of the Facebook issues of Cambridge Analytics and what that really meant in terms of aggregate usage. That's the harder side of the problem. So industry standards, to your specific question, can help here. And they've been, I think that's a constant piece that needs to happen generally, especially as we think about this digitized version of what we're talking about that you and I control for ourselves. And so that layers on top of this conversation of the next couple years of how do we make that work. And maybe it starts in regional pockets and then goes to more, platform-based pockets. And you're seeing lots of the larger providers that own the end user experience making some plays in this space. We're all familiar with our phones doing some form of biometric to some degree. those things are all starting to contribute to that I think is making the critical mass that will happen in the next couple of years for that digital identity to start to happen. And what the question is, what do we do until then? Right?
Yeah.
We got to work together.
And I think the other piece of this, you mentioned it earlier, from the consumer's perspective, there's, I want my experience to be secure for the obvious reason. But there is this concern, I think, that's growing because of the things you pointed to at the very early beginning of the presentation. They're concerned about privacy, and I think particularly when it comes to storing, biometric credentials. Who has access to that? How will it be used? Is it secure? And I think that, those of us in the industry understand these to be issues, but also understand a bit more than the average consumer about why it's a better approach. But how do you get consumers over that hump?
Yeah, and I think our friends in Europe have started that dialogue with consumers a lot more so. And again, I think all these consent windows don't necessarily appease consumers. I think it starts to make them more aware of the controls, right? It's not that I don't see those and suddenly feel better about things, right? It's just like, oh, I got a choice and now this thing's everywhere and I got to click through it. But I think ultimately the end state needs to happen where we bring that concept of regulation, where it forces the business side to do something, with the consumer side, where consumers can look and feel and touch and own their own identity, and then realize that data is not being stored in some central database. So all those things need to line up to get to this point where we think we'll get, this next major movement in the identity ecosystem. And those are big things to coordinate and make happen altogether. So that, again, that's been happening for many years in different ways. And you're starting to see, who doesn't see people walking down the street with a mobile phone? It's everywhere now. So that's now in place, right? We can start adding more pieces to that. And I think that will just gradually change consumer behavior. I think we're more comfortable with video technology. We all do it at work now almost all the time. All those things are changing that consumer side ever so slowly, and it's starting to build momentum.
But I think your point about, regulation versus the reality of what we need now is an important one, because, any kind of regulation takes so long, and often by the time it gets put in place, the evolution of a solution is so far beyond, because businesses have to do what businesses have to do to keep their own businesses safe and secure, and the consumer's assets secure as well. So, I know that there's this natural tension between regulation and innovation. I'd like to see more, industry consensus on the path forward. I think that would speed things up.
Yeah, and again, there's always got to be a benefit for the consumer, and sometimes this type of thing is difficult, but you think about what does identity do, and kind of the way we think about it as a company is it gives you access, right? It's the key to access. And if you think about it in that manner, it's not frictional, it's just part of what we need to do, right? And you're going into an area that needs to be protected. It's your area, or it's your part of the service. And so if the context of the conversation can shift less away from annoying frictional step I need to do to this is giving me access and this is what I just need to do in that case, and there's benefits as a result of that access, the consumer side will warm up a lot more quickly than what it does now in terms of the way it's being communicated to them.
Yeah, I think that's right, because I do think that perhaps before, consumers didn't think a lot about security when they were transacting, because they were thinking more about credentials, using, card credentials, knowing that they were protected. If anything happened, it was an inconvenience, but they were protected. I think now, there is this sense of, wow, my identity credentials are everywhere, and I need to take more care with how I'm accessing my own, information at the bank or wherever I'm accessing that information. And I want to know that whomever I'm doing business with has the same appreciation for, the cutting edge technology that allow us to do that. And I do think consumers will onboard some degree of friction to make that happen.
Yeah, and again, I think the good thing that GDPR has done is at least it's making them, I think the first step is the awareness that's happening, and then that what's following behind that is that ability to request that data and delete that data, which will all be layering out on everybody's sites, obviously. So those two things, we'll see how that plays out over the next 2 years about how those services are actually utilized. And that will start to show this appetite for the consumer base to manage their own data and spend a little bit of time, you know, quote unquote, opting out by deleting their data as it gets deposited in these different places.
Yeah, I think that will be an interesting experiment to watch. You know, my sense of it is people don't like the friction of those pop-up boxes, and they click. They're not really exactly sure what they're clicking because they're used to cookies, and they're like, okay, I just want to get to my content.
Right.
And you know, you never quite know what you're deleting. Like, am I supposed to delete that? Maybe I need that for something else. I mean, if I delete this, what does that do to something maybe connected to that? So I think, you know, it's not quite as, you know, black and white as I'm deleting it and that's that. I think there are a lot of interdependencies on some of this data that I think we still need to figure out and determine whether deleting has a ripple effect downstream that may not be what consumers want.
Yeah, and I would just say that I think with a biometric, hopefully all of us are much more careful about that versus a cookie about ourselves or even an email address, right? I think that's hopefully going to be one of the changes that happens, assuming a lot of this is the direction that we're all heading, which it appears to be.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. Well, listen, Kevin, this has been a fun conversation. It's been a thoughtful conversation, and I think you know, you've raised a number of issues about, you know, first the sophistication of fraudsters and how they really do have a lot of tools to, you know, to avoid the kind of campy spoofs that you know, we chuckled about, to really do things that are designed to hurt businesses and consumers by taking over their identity, and the approach to making sure that that they can't do it easily. So I really enjoyed the conversation and the insights you shared. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen, for having me, and I hope your audience enjoyed it.
I'm sure they did. Thanks, everyone, for giving us your time today. We will have a replay of this and a write-up on PYMNTS.com in just a couple of days. Thanks for joining us. Have a great rest of the day. Thanks again, Kevin.
Thanks.
Bye now.